And while we as yet have not identified this season's diamond, this author is happy to confirm that the diamond shall be anybody who is willing to devote their humanly remains to the study of medical anatomy. And as another matter of import, this may appear as any ordinary stunt along the paved Scott County line, but this author has come upon the knowledge that it will play an important role when two impetuous physicians fail to control their tempers in a squabble over the diamond. This scandal looks to spell tragedy. Or will it? Only time will tell. Yours truly, more versatile.
I'm sorry. So to see if you're the next audience participant, just check under your chair for a script or some props. And those hiding out on Zoom, you can just check your inbox. No, I'm just kidding. And I do have to give Shivani Reddy credit for identifying our department's board whistle. So I had intended to do an overview of early Kentucky medical history, but when I was reading through the stories, the talk really began to shift in a slightly different direction. So for this year's History of Medicine Grand Rounds, we're going to explore aspects of early American medical education and how a duel in 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky paved the way for the establishment of the American Medical Association. So we've got feuds and grave robbing, we've got secret societies, and of course, some Freemasonry thrown in. So should be an interesting hour ahead. So to start with, and before we get into any feuds or duels, I did want to start with just a little bit of background history on Kentucky, because when I started the project, I just really was wondering what it must have been like for people who are practicing on the frontier here in Kentucky in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So in 1776, the Virginia Assembly created the county, one solid county, which is great since Kentucky now has like the fourth most counties in the United States. But they took territory from Virginia's Fincastle County, took that part that was west of the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, and that became the county of Kentucky. Harrodstown, which was also called Old Town at that time, became the original county seat. And that's Harrodsburg, present day, and that's still the county seat of Mercer County today. And that was the first permanent settlement in Kentucky, and it had been settled in 1774, so just a few years earlier, by James Harrod. And it's here where we get some Daniel Boone involvement, and also involvement from Daniel Boone's younger, and I think, more fabulously named brother, Squire Boone. A couple years later, in 1780, the county gets divided up into Jefferson, Lincoln, and Fayette counties, which you can see on the map, if you can read it there on the left. And then around this time, Kentuckians here began to petition several times for statehood. And this was ultimately delayed, though, because the United States was transitioning from the Articles of Confederation to the constitutional governmental framework. So it wasn't that Virginia was necessarily opposed, but they gave consent for Kentucky statehood in 1789, and it was approved by the United States Congress on February 4th, 1791. Kentucky became a Commonwealth on June 1st, 1792. So we're just shy of 230 years. And that made it the 15th state, splitting from Virginia in the process. So this is Isaac Shelby, a cranky looking gentleman, but he was a really well-known military veteran from Virginia, and he was elected the first governor of Kentucky. I don't really care about that, but he is the connection to our next topic. So that was your, Kevin Bacon moment. So Ephraim McDowell. Does anybody know who Ephraim McDowell is? Or what Ephraim McDowell is? Outside. There you go. Yeah. So I think for a lot of people in the room, when I say Ephraim McDowell, the first thing you think about is the hospital in Danville. In fact, when you Google Ephraim McDowell, the hospital and its affiliated clinics are the first thing that pop up. But like most things, all of those buildings, all of that system is named after someone. And this is him. I was actually surprised by the number of Kentuckians that I randomly texted and called and were like, do you know who Ephraim McDowell is? And they were like, no. So I figured we would at least talk about him to start. So he was born in 1771 in Rockbridge County, Virginia. And You should know him because he was a prominent Kentucky physician and a pioneer surgeon. And I really liked that term, pioneer surgeon, because it's applicable to him in multiple ways. He was a physician and surgeon in a very early, young Kentucky, but he also was an innovator in the medical field. He's credited with performing the first ovariotomy, and in that capacity, he's regarded as a founding father of abdominal surgery. Pretty close to like a Benjamin Franklin status, but not quite there. He's also credited with perfecting the modern surgical technique of lithotomy. And one of his more notable patients was James K. Polk, the 11th US president, pictured here, on whom he removed a urinary stone and performed a hernia repair. So McDowell's home, for those who are interested, you can still visit it down in Danville. It's a museum. And he's memorialized in the U.S. Capitol Statuary Hall collection. And as mentioned a moment ago, the health system in Danville is named for him. So he was the 9th child born into his family. His father was a well-regarded military veteran named Samuel McDowell. And his father had served with George Washington in the French and Indian War. The family relocated from Virginia to Danville when Samuel McDowell was appointed a land surveyor and commissioner in 1784, so before Kentucky was a state. Ephraim's father was actually a pretty big proponent of statehood, and he was involved in drafting the state constitution. So Ephraim was educated early on in the United States, and then he went on to study as a medical student under a Dr. Alexander Humphreys in Stanton, not Staunton, but Stanton, Virginia. And he did that for 3 years prior to furthering his medical education at the world-renowned University of Edinburgh. He was there from 1793 to 1794. At that time, while he was there, he studied under some pretty big names, including Scottish anatomist and physician John Bell. And of note, McDowell never received a medical diploma during that time. He was awarded an honorary medical degree in 1825 from the University of Maryland, which was just a few years prior to his death. So he returned to Danville in 1795 to begin surgical practice. And there he married Isaac Shelby's daughter. So there's your first degree Kevin Bacon connection. Ironically though, so McDowell would end up dying from likely appendicitis in June of 1830. Kind of an ironic way for a surgeon to go. But so perhaps one of the more, or maybe most notable case for which Ephraim McDowell is known and remembered involved a patient named Jane Todd Crawford. So for me, as a school child growing up in central Kentucky, we went to Ephraim McDowell's home in Danville, and that was one of our field trips during elementary school. I remember it was a really cold day, and other than that, probably the only other thing I remember from that day was the story of this patient, because it was and is a pretty remarkable story. So the story goes that in 1809, Ephraim McDowell was called upon to assess 45-year-old Jane Todd Crawford from Greene County, Kentucky. This was about 60 miles away from Danville. And she was seeking medical attention when her pregnancy did not come to term. So 45-year-old. And she had assumed that she was carrying twins based on her enlarging abdomen. But McDowell figured out, however, that her condition was actually an enlarged ovarium. So accounts from that time note that the University of Edinburgh really helped to shape early gynecology. And so having studied there, McDowell was particularly well suited for this type of case. And then I also found pretty interesting, a Scottish surgeon who was fairly prominent named John Hunter espoused the belief that uterine growths and or tumors in theory were operable because he stated in a late 1700s lecture, quote, "There is no reason why women should not bear spaying as well as other animals." Kind of feel like he might have been calling women animals, but I'll just leave that there. So in this case, McDowell did recommend surgery for Jane Todd Crawford and said that if she could reach his practice in Danville, he would perform the procedure. So there's a nice Smithsonian article about this, and they referred to the procedure as the experiment, which, I mean, in all reality, it certainly was. So she consented. She said yes, because otherwise she probably felt like she was going to die, which she may have. She rode the 60 miles on horseback in December in Kentucky. And it took her 3 days to reach Danville. And one account that I came across said that she rested the tumor on the horn of her saddle for the arduous, uncomfortable journey. So on Christmas morning, 1809, the operation took place in the home of McDowell, likely on a kitchen table that was moved to the operating room, AKA a bedroom. And accounts of the mere 25-minute procedure, 25 minutes, tell of Miss Crawford reciting psalms and singing hymns, which we all know is a very effective form of anesthesia. I think it also has some antiseptic properties. All right, because it's 1809 and there is no anesthesia or antisepsis at this point. So I'm sure that was really enjoyable. So Joseph Lister's landmark paper on the antiseptic principle in the practice of surgery wasn't published until 1867. So quite a few years later. And at that time, he began a surgical revolution with his use of carbolic acid as a way of achieving antisepsis, not asepsis, but antisepsis. And then an equally revolutionary moment in surgical history was the introduction of anesthetic. So William T.G. Morton, who is pictured here with a fantastic mustache, was a dentist, and he is credited with the first effective administration in October 1846 on a very nervous young man and probably equally nervous surgeon named John Warren, who was going to be removing a vascular neck tumor from him at Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital in front of a packed room of medical students. The procedure and the efficacy of the anesthetic were a success, leaving the room full of dumbfounded medical students. So Morton named his creation, his anesthetic, Letheon, after the Lethe River of Greek mythology. And apparently drinking the waters of that river erased painful memories. So kind of a neat name. His concoction wasn't quite so fancy as that. It was just sulfuric ether. So back to McDowell and Crawford, where he didn't have the benefit of those two luxuries. At the completion of that mere 25-minute procedure, McDowell had removed 22 pounds of stuff, 15 pounds of a dirty gelatinous substance, followed by a 7-pound solid tumor. So Crawford then recovered nearby for 25 days, and then she rode home. She lived for another 32 years and died at the age of 78. And this is her. So I think you could call that a success. McDowell went on to publish the account of the procedure about 8 years later. So after I was, looking at this, I thought, well, why did McDowell go to Edinburgh? Why didn't he just train in the United States? Did he have any options that were local? And so I wanted to start kind of looking at that. So before formal medical schools appeared in America and elsewhere, medical education was mainly in the form of apprenticeships. Medicine, not entirely different from now, was basically separated into medicine and then surgery/anatomy. And so in late 18th century America, those students who were able and wanted to become physicians would travel to European centers like Edinburgh, London, and Paris to study under the European masters. And the options in the States at that time were fairly limited, and not to mention they were young and newly established. So looking at that first medical school, the first medical school in America opened in 1765 at the College of Philadelphia. And this school would evolve into the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine, which is still around today. The founding of this school in early years also had quite the story attached, because apparently its founders were also feuding. And so John Morgan and William Shippen Jr., who are pictured here in this lovely cartoon, did not get along. So prior to founding the medical school, both men had received their medical degrees from the University of Edinburgh, just like McDowell had. And they had both been praised by prominent Philadelphian and my distant relative by marriage, always have to throw that in, Benjamin Franklin. So while both were well-esteemed young men, by the time of the school's founding, it's reported that they were barely on speaking terms. And apparently that would only get worse over the years. So when they had been in Europe studying, both had ambitions of creating a medical school when they got back. And they both apparently met together with Benjamin Franklin and one of his friends, a prominent physician named John Fothergill, in London to discuss the future of medical education in the States. The issue was, though, that they both had very different ideas about what medical education should look like. Morgan thought that the school should be affiliated with a higher institute of learning, like the Edinburgh model, while Shippen, his vision more closely resembled the setup in London, which was a hospital-based teaching institution. Also, Shippen was more on the anatomy surgery side, and so he wanted to focus on those things and also on midwifery. And Morgan was more interested in focusing on the more gentlemanly theory and practice of the physic, which he thought would distinguish the physician from a more lowly apothecary or surgeon. I mean, I'm not from this time period, but I'm pretty sure those are fighting words. So they both came back to Philadelphia in the 1760s. And in 1762, Shippen over here began a series of lectures on anatomy. And these were the first of its kind delivered in America. Morgan returned around that time, and in a likely attempt to one-up Shippen, just went ahead without him to the College of Philadelphia Board of Trustees and proposed the establishment of a medical school. And they said yes. Adding more fuel to this feud, Morgan was said to have disparaged surgery as an unintellectual mechanical art repugnant to sensitive men. I feel like maybe we might disagree with that, but his medical school was not going to have a chair of surgery, and he wanted to leave that training to be continued to be taught by apprenticeship alone. So Shippen, not taking that line down, responded by addressing the trustees in writing, and he was subsequently hired or appointed by the college as the professor of anatomy and surgery. And Shippen, not Morgan, ended up giving the first lecture at the medical school on November 14th, 1765, a full 4 days ahead of Morgan. So it didn't end there, because when the Revolutionary War came around, Morgan was appointed Director General and Chief Physician of the Continental Army. And he didn't stay in that position long. He was dismissed after 2 years for multiple reasons, including his temperament, lack of tact and patience. And of course, who did they replace him with? Shippen. He also ended up being dismissed in no small part due to efforts of Morgan and another Penn Medical School faculty member, Benjamin Rush. But it was a little bit more serious, because they brought charges that resulted in Shippen being court-martialed in 1780. And although he was cleared and acquitted and reinstated, Benjamin Rush would apparently go on to continue to use these charges against Shippen for the remainder of his career, because he, quote, hated him. So we've got our first med school at UPenn in 1765 at the College of Philadelphia. Next comes the school founded by Dr. Samuel Bard at New York's King's College. This would go on to become Columbia present day in 1767. Then you had Harvard in 1782, where they established the Massachusetts Medical College. And then it's Dartmouth in 1797. And then the very most logical next medical school to be founded in the United States, Transylvania, here in Lexington, Kentucky. Some people want to argue about it, but okay, it's the 5th medical school. So Transy's Medical School was established in 1799. And we're going to talk a little bit about shifting into the history of that university. So the medical department was established in 1799, but Transy had already been around for a few years. It had been chartered in 1780 prior to statehood by the Virginia Assembly as the Transylvania Seminary. And it was the first college. It was the Pioneer Institute of High Learning, first college west of the Alleghenies. A well-known Virginian and 3rd U.S. President Thomas Jefferson was quoted as saying, "If we Virginians are to go a-begging anywhere for education, I would rather it be to Kentucky than any other state, because she has more of the flavor of the old cask than any other." He apparently also said that people coming back from Harvard came back as fanatics and Tories. So the first classes at the Transylvania Seminary were held in 1785 in Danville, Kentucky, in this cabin. And the name Transylvania means across the woods, which is where our title comes from. It's unclear exactly why they chose this name, but there was a failed colony in this area called Transylvania Colony, so probably from that. And unfortunately for me, this was like 100 years prior to the Bram Stoker's novel, so there were no Dracula connections. I really kind of hope there might be, but in 1793, a gift of land was donated to the Board of Trustees, but there was a catch. This land, called College Lot, was located here in present-day Gratz Park. And if they were going to take the land, they had to agree to move and maintain their campus here in Lexington. Obviously, they did. And so in 1799, Transylvania became Transylvania University after having moved to Lexington. At that time, they established the law and medical departments, which were the first in the West. So while the medical department was established in 1799, it was largely inactive until about 1815, when there was a restructuring. During that period, it was mostly just preceptorships, like traditional medicine training had been. But they had a restructuring in 1815, and they have the arrival of this gentleman, Horace Hawley, as the third president of the university. Now, he was a Unitarian minister from Boston, and he had a lot of influence and a lot of important connections in the East, including several US presidents and congressmen. And so he really helped to raise Transy's profile nationally quite a bit. The enrollment.
Thomas Jefferson, no.
Huh?
Did Thomas Jefferson know that he was
He probably said no thanks. No, but the university enrollment increased a lot during this period. And actually during the period from 1824 to 1835, the medical department at Transy's enrollment was the second largest among American medical schools. Hawley had professors travel to Europe to procure texts and tools for the medical and law departments at this time. And then with that restructuring and his arrival, new faculty members were appointed in the medical department, including Charles Caldwell, James Overton, Benjamin Dudley, Daniel Drake, and William Richardson. The first medical degree from the university was conferred in 1817. And it was said at that time that the medical school rivaled Harvard. So I'd like to go on next to give some background on the faculty members who are pictured here. Benjamin Dudley, Daniel Drake in the center, and then William Richardson, because they are going to become the central figures in the turmoil that would nearly destroy the medical department. Dun, dun, dun. All right, starting with Benjamin Dudley. He was born in Spotsylvania County, Virginia in 1785, and his family had moved to Kentucky when he was 1 year old. There was a neat story I came across that said that they traveled through the Cumberland Gap, and that's where he learned how to walk on that journey. So, I mean, how many people can say that? So goals for people who have new children. So his family ended up settling permanently in Lexington in 1797. And as a young man, Dudley apprenticed with a prominent Lexington doctor named Frederick Ridgely, who was also faculty at Transy in the early years. Under his instruction, apparently Dudley's ardent taste for medical knowledge was largely gratified, but he went on to enroll at UPenn Medical School at age 19 in 1804, where he would study alongside future colleagues, Daniel Drake and William Richardson. He ended up earning his medical degree 2 years later from UPenn in 1806, but he still felt like he wanted more training, wanted to go to Europe. So the story goes that after practicing and earning some money for a few years in Lexington, he took a flatboat full of produce down the Mississippi to New Orleans in 1810, sold that for profit, purchased a cargo of flour, which he then took and sailed with to Gibraltar on a prosperous voyage. And apparently after advantageously disposing of that cargo at Gibraltar and at Lisbon, he made his way with those profits to Paris and London. There he was able to study with leading European physicians, including Napoleon's personal physician, the Baron Dominique Larrey, who many people regard as the first battlefield surgeon. And he became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons before he returned to Lexington in 1814. So a couple years later, in 1817, he accepted an appointment to become the chair of anatomy and surgery at Transy's medical department. He ended up staying in that position until about 1850 when he retired. So while he wasn't the most electric lecturer, apparently he was and is a well-known surgeon because he performed many procedures, including lithotomy, trephination, and also some ophthalmologic procedures. In fact, some sources stated that Dudley performed a cataract surgery in 1836 and gave sight to a man who had been blind since birth. He's also credited with likely performing the first trephination for cure of epilepsy in America. And multiple sources I came across cited his attention to cleanliness and the use of boiled cistern water for procedures and bandages and washing of hands in the pre-Listerian era. I also came across a neat article written about the rise of professional surgery in the United States in the period from 1800 to 1865. And that author cited Benjamin Dudley as probably the greatest of American operators, with a record of more than 200 cases with only a half dozen fatalities. She did say, though, that one of his contemporaries, Philip Singh Physic, achieved more fame, probably due to more careful recording of his surgeries by his nephew, and also because he operated on Chief Justice John Marshall. So that kind of common theme, it's not it's not what you know or do, but some of it's who you know and what you take credit for. But nonetheless, Dudley still remained regarded for his efforts. And Transy has a museum, the Musnick Museum, and Special Archives and Artifacts collection, where they have some of his belongings, including his surgical instruments, which are ivory handled, quite the status symbol. They also have this skull up here in the top, which has a trephination hole. It was a successful procedure. It was a healed hole in that skull. It is thought that some of Dudley's admiring medical students dug it up for him as a trophy. Don't get any ideas. Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. His house is here in town. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. That may be a connection to that. Also was a book written by a Transy medical grad who put down his recollections, Dudley's recollections about him, excuse me. And I thought it was kind of a neat book because this talks in more detail about his use of trying to sterilize the water, boiling cistern water in this period where we just didn't know a whole lot about germs. And the other thing I found kind of neat was this description that he put in this book about a time when he came across Benjamin Dudley and Henry Clay at his home. Apparently they were friends. So moving on to Daniel Drake. He was an important physician in the Kentucky and Ohio region, a prolific writer, and a man who apparently could only be tolerated in small doses. He was described as pugnacious, and he would be challenged to multiple duels during his lifetime. So he was born in 1785 in New Jersey into a poor family who moved to Kentucky in 1788 looking for better opportunities. So although his early schooling was limited, he was able to learn to read by age 7, and he went on to become an apprentice to one of the first physicians in Cincinnati, Dr. William Goforth, at the age of 13 in 1798. He's notable because he is the first recipient of a medical degree to be given west of the Appalachian Mountains, and that's pictured here. And that was granted by Dr. William Goforth of Cincinnati in 1805, after Drake had spent a couple of years training with him. He did go on, though, to spend 2 more years studying at UPenn in Philadelphia alongside Dudley. And then he came back and opened a practice in Kentucky before moving back to Cincinnati in 1807. He was there for a little bit, but then he took a position at Transy in 1816, where he only stayed for 1 term before returning back to Cincinnati, where he was instrumental in founding the Medical College of Ohio. He remained there as president until 1823, when one biography stated that the medical college's faculty developed a strong dislike for him and voted to remove him. While that didn't happen, he felt unwanted, and so he took a position back at Transy. but only until 1826, when he again returned to Cincinnati, this time opening the Cincinnati Eye Infirmary in 1827. And he was also at that time instrumental in establishing a school for the blind. So he continued bouncing around the Ohio-Mississippi River Valley, including a stint at the Louisville Medical Institute. And after all that bouncing around, no big surprise to find out that Daniel Drake and Benjamin Dudley did not get along. And their feuding apparently was ignited in part by their disagreement over a faculty colleague, one William Richardson. So there's not as much on his slide. I had to use a large picture because there's not a whole lot of information known about William Richardson. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, so if that tells you anything. So William Richardson, though, we do know he was a classmate of Drake and Dudley at UPenn. And at that time, medical courses at UPenn ran from the fall to the spring. And it was the same course of lectures. And students were required to complete that course of study twice in order to get a medical degree. So while Richardson completed the coursework the first time around, kind of didn't go back for the second course of lectures. And so he didn't actually earn a degree. Just slight details. So according to an account, he instead began courting wealthy patrons and practicing medicine in the Philadelphia area. And he was able to gain enough of a reputation doing this that he secured a position at Transy as a professor of obstetrics and diseases of women and children. Dudley and another colleague named James Overton were very opposed to his appointment because he didn't have a medical degree, and so they worked to get him fired. Drake, not liking Dudley, sympathized with Richardson, and he arranged for him to be granted an honorary degree from a New York medical school, so not even the one he had attended. So Richardson was able to keep his job on a technicality. So I came across somewhere that said that Dudley was said to have bound his friends to him with the strongest ties and treated his hostile enemies, who were few, with a cordial hatred. And I really liked that. I was like, I got to work that into my, So with this incident, Drake was now firmly on Dudley's enemy list. So now that we've kind of talked about the growing dissension among the faculty members at Transy, I wanted to shift gears for a bit to discuss a challenging aspect of medical education that will play a role in this developing feud. So, as the formal study of medicine advanced both in Europe and in America in the 18th and 19th centuries, the lack of available cadavers for dissection and study of anatomy was a recurring theme. I kept coming across this. So some of our earliest accounts of the study of human anatomy come from the University of Alexandria in Egypt around 330 BC. And then there's a little gap. And then the next big figure was Galen, who's pictured here. And he was a well-known Greek physician and surgeon who lived in the Roman Empire, living between 129 and 216 AD or Common Era, whichever you prefer. So Galen dissected Barbary apes and pigs instead of humans because human dissections were strictly prohibited in the Roman Empire at this time. And his work would be accepted for nearly 1,300 years. And while his work was groundbreaking, he was extrapolating at sometimes incorrectly from animal anatomy. Also, apparently, to add to this, a lot of people didn't necessarily realize that his views on human anatomy were drawn largely from animal dissections. It's a little tricky there sometimes. So it wasn't until the 16th century with Vesalius, who's pictured here, that there was a shift to a more modern understanding based on human dissection. Vesalius, who lived between 1514 and 1564, is considered the founder of the modern human anatomy field, and he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, or On the Fabric of the Human Body, in 1543. And this had beautiful illustrations of human anatomy that had been done by an artist. And the human figures seen here were drawn in great detail, often in allegorical poses. That same year, in 1543, Vesalius conducted a public dissection of the body of a notorious felon from Basel, Switzerland, named Jacob Kerr von Gebweiler. He was able to assemble and articulate the bones, and he donated that skeleton to the University of Basel. This preparation, the basal skeleton, is Vesalius's only well-preserved skeletal preparation and also the world's oldest surviving anatomical preparation. And it's still on display there in Basel. So my husband kept, every time I put the slide up, he'd be like, no hands, missing a foot. And so I don't know if that was from his days as a felon or if it was just lost over time. So between Galen and Vesalius, medical students in the Middle Ages were often taught anatomy via the reading of a text, often Galen or some other contemporary, while watching a surgeon barber perform a directed dissection. And typically this was only done once a year, once each academic year, generally during the cold months, since embalming was not common practice during this time. So it was like a short schedule, very regimented when you read about these things. And since cadavers were in short supply, medical schools and students had to be creative. And so you get the first incident reported of grave robbing by medical students in Bologna, Italy in about 1319. It's likely that medical students across Europe were engaging in this practice, either digging up bodies themselves or purchasing them from churchyard attendants. In 1752 in England, the Murder Act passes, which allowed for the corpses of executed murderers to be taken to the Company of Surgeons in London for study and teaching. Now, in America and across other parts of Europe, there were no such laws, so cadavers were often obtained by grave robbing or resurrection, because those performing the grave robbing or body snatching often referred to themselves as resurrectionists, which does have a decidedly more elegant flair. So I came across a book by an 1822 graduate of Transy's medical department named C.C. Graham, and that's him, where he described the medical students stealing corpses from local graveyards. And he said, dead bodies at that day were not articles of commerce. So we, the students, had to disinter them. We once had a battle, so published in the newspapers at the old Baptist graveyard, the Battle of the Graveyard, so called. He describes another incident near Nicholasville where we were pursued when making our way to our horses hitched outside an orchard fence, and one ball of several fired lodged in the subject, the corpse being carried on my back. And this is an illustration from his book. And then I also came across a really neat article from Smithsonian Magazine in 2018, focusing on Baltimore's thriving grave robbing business in the 19th century. There was apparently a robust 70-year period during which time bodies that were disinterred in Baltimore were shipped to medical schools across the country via the newly burgeoning railroad system that was connecting the young country. Unintended consequences, right? So Baltimore apparently was a prime location, being located in a temperate zone where they could dig up bodies in the winter while ground in New England and the Midwest was frozen solid. The bodies were said to have been transported in barrels filled with whiskey to mask the odor. And a particularly sordid detail from the article indicates that that remaining whiskey was sold and called rot gut whiskey, and people would drink it as a stiff drink. So gross. Anyway, so obviously grave robbing was not the most moral or ethical way to obtain cadavers for the study of anatomy. And honestly, it's kind of cringeworthy to think that people were doing this commonly and that people were profiting off of it. Unfortunately, there was little to stop the activity at that time. And in many cases, bodies of criminals, those whose bodies were unclaimed, African Americans, and others who weren't particularly well regarded or represented in society were the victims. This also included people who had committed suicide. And I came across a piece from the Pen and Slavery Project discussing William Shippen's involvement in body snatching. And after being accused, apparently Shippen took out an ad in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper trying to defend himself by asserting that he never dissected bodies from the church graveyard, only those, bless you, of persons who had willfully murdered themselves or were publicly executed, except now and then one from the potter's field. And potter's fields were places where people who were kind of unknown were buried, and that nature. So I was looking for a way when I was putting this together to be able to add William King Solomon into this talk. And I finally got a chance here because William King Solomon was a well-known alcoholic and vagrant here in Lexington, who was charged with public intoxication. And apparently the punishment for that was to be sold at auction to serve for 12 months as an indentured servant. At the auction, 2 Transylvania medical students offered a small sum for him, assuming that he would die soon of alcoholic cirrhosis, and then they would be able to dissect his body. Fortunately for Solomon, they were outbid by his childhood nurse, Aunt Charlotte, who went on to free him to resume his derelict ways. But it didn't end there, though, because William King Solomon ended up becoming a hero of the 1833 cholera plague here in Lexington by serving as a grave digger when the usual workers had died or fled. And unfortunately and ironically, he ended up perishing of cholera in 1854, but was buried a hero's burial in the Lexington Cemetery. For those of you who are interested, there is a good book here, The Pie Seller, the Drunk, and the Lady by Terry Foodie that talks about the 1833 cholera epidemic. So Dr. Charles T. Ambrose, who was a professor of microbiology, immunology, and molecular genetics here at UK's College of Medicine, had an immense interest in 18th and 19th century medicine, and that drew him over to Transy, where he became a significant benefactor of the university's special collections. He's written, well, he's passed away now, but he wrote multiple articles about this time period, one of which was entitled Grave Robbing in Lexington and Elsewhere. And in it, he kind of gave an explanation for why gave other reasons why people were opposed to grave robbing and why we shouldn't have been disinterring the dead. He noted that most cultures abhorred the desecration of the dead, and that some thought that the soul left the body only little by little, so the newly deceased might feel pain. Another explanation, which I think is pretty reasonable, was that there was a worry that the spirits of the disturbed dead might seek revenge. So, as you can tell, there was a lot of shady type business going on in early American medical practice and education. Lots of feuding, grave robbing, a lot of people who are practicing without medical degrees. And so if you just look for this kind of stuff, there's multiple articles and accounts from old books discussing the discord and feuding among early American physicians. I thought this was a nice cartoon from November of 1785. It's called Doctors Differ by a British illustrator. And so all that we've discussed so far this morning about the general atmosphere among physicians in the early United States, feuding, arrogance, lack of ethics, and morality governing most of practice and education, in some ways came to a head here in Lexington in the summer of 1818. So I already kind of started talking about those hostilities that were simmering among the faculty at Transy. And what came next kind of seemed like the stuff of fiction, but ended up playing a large role in the founding of the American Medical Association. So this portion of the story begins in the summer of 1818 with an unfortunate Irishman here in Lexington who had imbibed a few too many when a fight broke out. He unfortunately fell, hit his head on a curb, and that resulted in his untimely death. So there are different accounts and they differ, but basically Dudley ended up performing the autopsy on this gentleman. And what came next was a nasty feud because Drake accused Dudley of botching the autopsy. One source noted that Dudley had only examined the head of the patient or the brain of the patient, found that he died of cerebral injury or edema, and then didn't examine the rest of the body because he wanted to keep that for anatomical study for the benefit of his medical students, since bodies were in short supply. C.C. Graham, that medical student from earlier, in that book, so that so-called Battle of the Graveyard, described how they were taking up the Irishman that caused the duel. So autopsy, he was buried, and then the medical students recovered the body. And he said that they were caught and they were taken to the courthouse for trial, but there was no law to make the dead private property. So the declaration of scripture that from dust we came and unto dust we must return let us off by paying 1 cent damages for taking that much soil or clay. So just as a side note, there were no laws against grave robbing then, but as of 1992, Kentucky Revised Statute 525-115 makes it a Class D felony to violate a grave, apparently punishable by up to 5 years in prison. For those of you who are curious, I was looking, well, it's a Class D felony. So there was one website I came across that likened it to cultivating 5 or more marijuana plants. Violating grave, it's pretty similar. Anyway, so Drake contended that Dudley had used an improper method of autopsy and had therefore neglected his duty. So what happened next was that these two started lambasting each other in local public pamphlets and newspaper articles, I guess like a Twitter war or something. But I came across an 1839 series of letters to the editor from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal entitled Letters from the West. These were authored only, the author was only, his initials were the only thing given, and it was WJB, and I couldn't figure out who that was, but he apparently had reviewed these writings in question and wrote about them. So he reported that Dudley described one of Drake's pamphlets as unprecedented for its low vulgarity, unequaled for its abuse of individual character. Not to be outdone, though, Drake responded with a 34-page duodecimo in which he admitted that Dudley's pamphlet, quote, would be a fair subject for criticism if its grammar, orthography, and punctuation were not so wretched as to sink the dignity of any reviewer who might condescend to touch it. To say, Drake, not a fan of the Oxford comma, so I am not a fan of his. But all of this vitriol ultimately resulted in Dudley challenging Drake to a duel. So dueling was fairly common in the South, and that could be a whole nother topic of talk. Apparently at the peak of dueling in New Orleans, there were like 3 to 4 duels a day, and you could only duel if you were upper class. And so there's a lot of rules about this, but Drake didn't believe in dueling. So he just simply said, no, thanks. But this was a matter of honor. And so poor old William Richardson stepped up to defend his friend's honor, perhaps in return for Drake having saved his job by arranging for him to get his questionable honorary medical degree. Dudley didn't seem to care about the substitution since he despised both men and wasn't going to pass on an opportunity to shoot either of them. So the setting was on the Fayette-Scott County line at the dueling tree. Yes, there was a dueling tree. And this is what remains of the dueling tree, a stump because it was blown down in a windstorm in 1992. So it's located on land that's now in the Kentucky Horse Park. Weekend trip. And duels were fought here on the county line because it was illegal. And so if the sheriff arrived, the participants could just simply step over the county line and be in a different jurisdiction. So on that fateful morning in August, both men arrived with their seconds and their surgeons. I know way more about dueling now because of Bridgerton. But there was a coin toss. The men walked their 10 paces, turned, faced each other, and shots were fired. Richardson apparently missed wide. Dudley, however, did not, and delivered a mortal wound to Richardson's groin, severing an artery. But being a gentleman and a surgeon, he obtained permission, and then he applied appropriately placed pressure to stem the bleeding long enough for the artery to be ligated. Richardson survived, and the two men became lifelong friends. All's well that ends well, I suppose. But that wasn't it. The duel had other unforeseen consequences. Dudley and Richardson were both prominent Kentucky Freemasons, because of course they were. And the Brotherhood felt compelled to punish them for their unmasonic behavior. So they were both suspended. And even though there was a motion for expulsion on the table, it was tabled in favor of allowing Brother Henry Clay, who was the U.S. Speaker of the House at that time, and known as the Great Pacifier or the Great Compromiser, to broker a truce between the two men, which he did successfully. And additionally, in the days following that duel, a meeting was held at the Lexington courthouse between prominent citizens, and they published a lengthy statement in the local Kentucky Gazette on August 7th, 1818, vowing to put an end to the deadly combat. I mean, good intentions, but dueling continued for decades, finally dying off around the Civil War. So at Transy and the aftermath of that duel and all of the strife that had led up to it, a faculty member, seen here, Samuel Brown, who was a surgeon, hoped to inoculate the students against such unworthy conduct. It was written of Brown that he sought by all means, by precept and example, to sustain the dignity, vindicate the honor, and raise the status of the profession. So the open warfare, turmoil, and feuding and dueling wasn't limited to Lexington. And around this time, a physician in Philadelphia had said that their colleagues lived in a constant state of warfare, quarreling, and even worse, street fights. Many historians cited that competition for paying patients was the driving force for much of the hostility that was seen. Obviously, there were some other factors, not to ignore the egos we've already talked about. But Brown went on to ultimately establish a student fraternity at Transy in 1820 called the Kappa Lambda Society of Hippocrates. He hoped that this would rein in the rowdiness and instill some professional decorum. He made it a secret society with a secret symbol and a password. And this was one of the first earliest secret college societies in the United States. Transy, woo, go. And some sources recognize it as second only behind Phi Beta Kappa, established at the College of William and Mary. So the aims of the society, taking cues from Thomas Percival's text on medical ethics, were to promote medical science, to communicate reports of interesting cases and diseases. And for Transy, this was a big one, to cultivate friendly and brotherly feelings between practitioners. And then lastly, to establish branches of this society in all states of the Union. So while this chapter in Lexington only lasted for about a decade, the society was successful in establishing notable branches in multiple East Coast cities, including New York and Philadelphia. And Charles Ambrose had said that it was badly needed because there was chronic dissension among doctors in those cities. And then he also said a Philadelphia physician around that time of the establishment noted that harmony, or at least comparative harmony, was restored among its members. So I know it looks like we're going to talk about the demise of the Kappa Lambda Society, but except clearly we're going to talk more about Freemasonry because, I mean, why not? But the demise of the secret Kappa Lambda Society was tied in some part to the demise of poor William Morgan here, who disappeared in 1826. He got himself on the wrong side of the New York Freemasons, allegedly posing as a Mason to attend meetings, and then publicly announced that he was going to write a book detailing and exposing the secrets of the Brotherhood. Obviously, this went over super well because after being arrested on some vague charge, he was released and then seen getting into a carriage with several men, never to be seen or heard from again. A body did wash up in Lake Ontario a few days later, but no one was arrested. His book did end up getting published, but instead of that focus being on that, it was more focused on his suspicious disappearance and on Freemasonry. Unfortunately, this also drew a lot of unwanted attention on other secret societies, including Kappa Lambda and Phi Beta Kappa. And so at this time, there were claims of hospitals being overrun with Kappa Lambda members. And then similar to the outings of the McCarthy era in the 1950s, lists of members of these secret societies were made public. And so membership declined in response, and then Kappa Lambda ended up folding. However, many physicians saw value in having a similarly structured society. And so in 1847, representatives from 40 medical societies and 28 medical schools convened at Philadelphia's Academy of Natural Sciences to establish the American Medical Association. They incorporated an official code of conduct that was patterned after Thomas Percival's medical ethics, just as Kappa Lambda had done. And the association's preamble for its constitution stated that one of its purposes was to foster friendly intercourse between those engaged in the medical profession. Again, largely echoing sentiments expressed by Kappa Lambda. So along with addressing professional ethics and etiquette, the goal of the AMA was also regulation, medical education, certification, and licensure. And many prominent Kappa Lambda members went on to hold very powerful positions in the AMA, which we all know obviously survives to present day. So this is how feuds, a duel, and a murder culminated in creating the foundations of the American Medical Association. What ended up happening to Transy? So 1830s had a lot of stagnation in the economic vitality here in Lexington. And so students were drawn away from Lexington to river cities of Louisville and Cincinnati. There was also mention of lack of cadavers being something that pulled them away. In 1837, led by a faculty member from Transy, Dean Charles Caldwell, half of the medical faculty left to join the Louisville Medical Institute. And then finally in 1859, the medical department ended up closing, but they had already trained 6,500 medical students, 1,800 or so of whom actually earned a Doctor of Medicine degree. The university as a whole ended up having interruption of studies by the Civil War, and those medical buildings were made into hospitals, makeshift hospitals for Union troops. So even though that medical department was short-lived, its legacy lived on through its trainees, many of whom ended up serving as battlefield physicians and surgeons during the Civil War and took care of multitudes of patients across the South. Also for its involvement in the establishment of Kappa Lambda, which went on to eventually become the American Medical Association in some other form. And so it leaves behind a very rich medical legacy here in this area, even if it's not well known. And so some other important takeaways before we finish, just medicine at the turn of the century was largely experimental, unregulated, and in many cases not governed by the best ethics or morality, as highlighted by the things we've talked about today. But other issues that came up were informed consent, which at many points during history has been lacking. And so we always just look at medicine's ever evolving, and we're always practicing medicine because it's not a perfected art. And so I'm sure at some point down the road, people are going to look at what we're doing now and just feel like, what were they thinking, and find things incredulous. But as always, we're all a product of the time period in which we live. And for me, that's one of the many joys that I find in studying history. So with that, I will say thank you. Pretty close to on time. And I'm not an expert, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try and take them. References, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I think it was like Kentucky statehood. I don't know if it was 6. I'm going to probably get more than 6, but Kentucky statehood with Isaac Shelby, Ephraim McDowell, who studied at Edinburgh, and then Morgan and Shippen, who also studied at Edinburgh, then to establishment of the first medical schools, sort of transy there, and then on to the professors there, and the duel to the American Medical Association. So it was like connecting Kentucky, early Kentucky, Isaac Shelby-ish to the AMA. So, or Kappa Lambda to AMA. So, I mean, it's kind of fudging it a little bit, but you know, and Kevin Bacon's probably got a doctor. So AMA.
The highest award it used to get to the level of
Yes. Yeah.
now, yeah. It doesn't seem like such a great deal.
Well, yeah. Well, I was gonna say that on his slide. Oh, there it was. So this is from the UC website. So I found that interesting. I mean, so they recognize, I mean, and a lot of the stuff about Morgan and Shippen comes from UPenn. So I think it was interesting. They all recognized how complex and difficult a lot of these people were that founded these medical institutions. So it was really interesting to read through these stories. And I always tell my husband, I'm like, I've got all this stuff in my head and I'm trying to put it out. And like, I know stuff that I feel like I'm not putting in here. So I'm always like, does it make sense? Did it make sense? So.
You know, Dr. William Richardson, if there's any connection.
Well, so when I was Googling, I was trying to find pictures and like, we always think about that, but like I was Googling William Richardson and he pops up almost every time when you search Google images. And I,
Just a
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of his stuff is what, I mean, there's a Transylvania Treasures like magazine. I think it's now defunct, but it's really neat. And he wrote, and there's also there's a history professor at UK who specializes in history of medicine, or the area of concentration, who I've been in contact before for these. And he also has written some pretty interesting things in those Transy treasures. So. Yeah. That's amazing.